Whispers echoed through Bitterroot Valley when 17-year-old Leo Farnsworth sacrificed his last acres of fertile soil to plant a wall of thick pine trees. Neighbors laughed, calling it a fool's decoration. They stopped laughing when the sky turned black, the temperature plummeted, and the deadliest blizzard in a century struck. Dust billowed behind a rusting 1989 Ford F-250 as it groaned down the fractured asphalt of County Road 9. At the wheel sat Leo Farnsworth, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles shone white beneath a thick layer of grease and Montana topsoil. He was 17, but the harsh sun and the crushing weight of his family's impending ruin had etched the exhaustion of a much older man into his face. In the truck bed behind him lay his cargo, not feed, not fertilizer, and certainly not the spare parts needed to fix the farm's broken combine harvester. Instead, the bed was overflowing with nearly 200 8-foot-tall blue spruce and lodgepole pine trees, their massive burlap-wrapped root balls pressing heavily against the truck's suspension. Selling the farm's only working tractor to purchase landscaping trees was an act that had officially crowned Leo as the laughingstock of the valley. Pulling into the gravel driveway of the Farnsworth homestead, Leo killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sharp, whistling wind that always seemed to claw at their property. Ahead of him stood the family barn. It was a sprawling, majestic structure, built by his great-grandfather in the early 1900s, but time and gravity were winning their long war against its wooden bones. The roof sagged under the invisible weight of decades, and the western wall bowed inward like a bruised rib cage. Inside that barn rested the last hope of the Farnsworth bloodline. After his father, Arthur, was paralyzed in a logging accident 2 years prior, medical bills had systematically devoured their savings. But Arthur had spent his entire life cultivating a proprietary breed of winter-hardy heirloom wheat. The seeds, meticulously cataloged and stored in climate-controlled silos within that very barn, were completely immune to the devastating frost blights that regularly bankrupted neighboring farms. They were worth millions to the right agricultural firm, and everyone in town knew it. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, pulling Leo from his thoughts. Gregory Higgins stood by the property line, leaning against the polished hood of a brand-new, jet-black Silverado. Higgins was the valley's corporate titan, a man who had spent the last decades swallowing up small family farms and transforming them into soulless, industrialized megaplots. "I heard the rumors down at Sarah Mitchell's feed store, but I didn't want to believe them," Higgins said, a greasy, condescending smile stretching across his face. He adjusted his expensive sunglasses, his eyes sweeping over the truck bed full of evergreens. "You actually sold your John Deere to buy lawn ornaments, Leo? Is this your strategy to save the farm?" "Curb appeal?" Leo unlatched the tailgate, letting it slam down with a heavy metallic clang. He grabbed a pair of thick leather work gloves from the dashboard. "These aren't ornaments, Mr. Higgins, and the farm isn't for sale." Higgins chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any real humor. "Arthur is lying in a hospital bed in Missoula. You are 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank is going to foreclose before the first snow flies. I offered you a generous buyout, $200,000, Leo, enough to pay for your father's physical therapy and get you an apartment in the city. All you have to do is sign over the deed in the barn." "The seeds aren't yours," Leo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register as he hopped into the truck bed and began wrestling the first massive pine toward the edge. "My father spent 30 years developing that wheat. You just want to patent it and bleed the rest of the valley dry. You're not getting this land." "You're a stubborn boy," Higgins sneered, his smile finally vanishing, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "But you're also stupid. You're standing in the middle of a wind tunnel. My engineers surveyed this entire basin. When the winter crosswinds sweep down from the northern ridge, they hit this property at maximum velocity. That rotting barn of yours won't survive another heavy winter. It's going to collapse, and when it does, your precious climate silos will rupture. The seeds will freeze, and you will have absolutely nothing." Leo didn't answer. He just dropped the first heavy root ball onto the dirt with a heavy thud. Higgins shook his head in mock pity, climbed into his luxury truck and sped away, kicking up a shower of loose gravel that peppered Leo's boots. For the next 3 weeks, long after the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks and the autumn air turned sharp enough to slice skin, Leo dug. He didn't just plant the trees in a neat, decorative row along the driveway. Instead, he measured precise, calculated angles, consulting a battered, leather-bound journal his late grandfather had left behind. His grandfather had been a military engineer, obsessed with fluid dynamics and aerodynamics. Leo planted the massive pines in a dense, multi-layered wedge formation, an arrowhead of timber pointing directly toward the treacherous northern gorge. He placed the lodgepole pines on the outer edge, their flexible trunks designed to bend without snapping, while the thick, impenetrable blue spruces were staggered tightly behind them, their branches interlocking like the shields of a Roman phalanx. He watered them, fertilized them with the last of their chemical reserves, and packed the rocky soil down until his hands bled through his gloves. Townspeople would drive by on Sunday afternoons, slowing down to point and laugh. Sarah Mitchell, the usually kind-hearted feed store owner, even drove out to leave a casserole on the porch, her eyes filled with pity as she watched Leo fiercely digging another hole in the freezing mud. They all thought the grief and the pressure had finally broken the boy's mind. They thought he was trying to build a beautiful garden for his crippled father to look at from the window before the bank came to take it all away. None of them realized that Leo Farnsworth wasn't building a garden. He was building a fortress. Winter did not arrive in the Bitterroot Valley. It ambushed it. By mid-November, a heavy, suffocating frost had already strangled the remaining crops, turning the once golden fields into vast oceans of brittle, blackened stalks. The town of Oakhaven was tense, the diner buzzing with uneasy gossip over steaming mugs of cheap black coffee. But the favorite topic of conversation remained the Farnsworth boy and his bizarre, towering wall of evergreens. Inside the warmth of the Oakhaven diner, Sheriff Tom Halstead sat in a corner booth, nursing his coffee and watching the local farmers swap stories. Halstead was a man of quiet authority, his silver hair neatly parted, his eyes sharp and observant. He had known Leo since the boy was in diapers, and it twisted his gut to see the town turning on the kid. "I'm telling you, the boy has lost his marbles," grunted Carl Jenkins, a burly cattle rancher whose property bordered the southern edge of Higgins's massive estate. "Drove past the Farnsworth place yesterday. He's got ropes tied between those trees, staking them into the ground like he's setting up a circus tent. He spent the last of Arthur's money on a landscaping project. It's a damn tragedy." Sheriff Halstead set his mug down with a sharp clack. "Leo is doing what he thinks is right, Carl. Leave the kid alone. He's got enough on his plate with Arthur's medical bills and the bank breathing down his neck." "I ain't bothering him, Tom," Carl defended, holding up his calloused hands. "But you can't deny facts. Gregory Higgins bought up the entire northern timber ridge last month. Did you hear? Higgins clear-cut the whole damn thing. 300 acres of old-growth forest chopped down and sold for lumber." Halstead frowned, leaning forward. "Higgins clear-cut the northern ridge? When?" "Finished it up last Tuesday," Carl replied, taking a bite of his toast. "Said he needed to clear the land to expand his soy operation in the spring. But without those old trees on the ridge, there's nothing to stop the wind coming off the mountains. The valley floor's gonna catch hell this winter." A cold spike of dread hammered into Sheriff Halstead's chest. The northern ridge was the valley's natural windbreak. It was the only geographical feature that prevented the brutal Arctic drafts from sweeping directly into the basin. By clear-cutting the ridge, Higgins hadn't just expanded his farmland. He had essentially created a massive, unobstructed funnel, and sitting directly at the bottom of that funnel was the Farnsworth farm. Halstead threw a $5 bill on the table and bolted out the door into the biting cold. Back at the farm, Leo was exhausted. His muscles screamed with lactic acid, and his fingers were numb despite the heavy gloves. The trees had taken root, their massive interlocking branches forming a dense, impenetrable green wall in the shape of a massive arrowhead, wrapping tightly around the vulnerable northern and western sides of the sagging barn. He was currently checking the heavy-duty steel cables he had used to anchor the trunks of the spruces to deep concrete pylons he'd poured in the dead of night. The crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Sheriff Halstead's cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights briefly illuminated the darkening afternoon sky. Halstead stepped out, wrapping his heavy winter coat tightly around his chest. "Leo!" Halstead called out, marching toward the barn. He stopped and stared up at the massive wall of trees. Up close, it didn't look like a decoration. It looked imposing. It looked like a barricade. "Son, we need to talk." Leo tightened a steel turnbuckle with a heavy wrench, not looking away from his work. "If you're here to serve foreclosure papers, Sheriff, you're a week early. The bank gave me until the end of the month." "I'm not here about the bank," Halstead said, his tone urgent. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's about Gregory Higgins. He clear-cut the northern timber ridge, Leo. All of it. Every last tree is gone." Leo stopped turning the wrench. He slowly lowered his arms, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he turned to look at the sheriff. A dark, terrifying realization washed over his young face. "He stripped the ridge?" "Yes," Halstead said grimly. "I don't think it was just for lumber, Leo. Higgins is a greedy bastard, but he's not stupid. He knows your barn is structurally compromised. He knows the only thing protecting this side of the valley from a direct hit by northern storm fronts was that old-growth forest. With those trees gone, the next major storm is going to rip right through that gap and hit your property with the force of a freight train." Leo looked past the sheriff, staring out toward the horizon. The sky to the north wasn't just gray. It was a bruised, sickly purple. The air had gone completely still. It was an unnatural, suffocating silence, the kind of quiet that only occurs when the atmospheric pressure violently plummets. "He's trying to destroy the barn," Leo whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with boiling rage. "He wants the wind to collapse the roof. If the climate silos freeze, my father's seeds die. Higgins can swoop in, buy the foreclosed land for pennies, and blame it on a natural disaster." "I can't prove intent," Halstead warned, placing a heavy, sympathetic hand on Leo's shoulder. "But the National Weather Service just issued an emergency broadcast on the radio. They're tracking an anomaly. An Alberta clipper, but massive. The meteorologists are saying it's a cyclical pressure system, the kind that only forms once every 50 years. They're calling it a localized hurricane of snow. It's going to hit the valley tonight." Leo turned around and looked at his wall of pine trees. His grandfather's journals had detailed the mathematics of wind deflection. The aerodynamic wedge shape of the tree line was designed to slice a high-velocity wind current in half, forcing the destructive energy to flow around the structure rather than slam directly into it. But Leo had calculated those angles, assuming the northern ridge was still intact, to slow the wind down first. Without the ridge, the trees wouldn't just be deflecting a storm. They would be taking a direct, unfiltered impact from a 50-year blizzard. "You need to evacuate," Halstead urged, grabbing Leo by the arm. "Get your father's truck. Pack whatever you can. I'm opening the high school gymnasium in town as an emergency shelter. This barn is not going to stand, Leo. It's suicide to stay here." "Ah!" Leo yanked his arm out of the sheriff's grip. He looked at the frail, groaning wood of the barn, and then at the proud, dark green needles of the spruces he had bled for. Inside that barn was his father's legacy. Inside that barn was his family's only chance at survival. "I'm not leaving, Tom," Leo said, his voice hardening into steel. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy master padlock, walking toward the large wooden double doors of the barn. "Higgins thinks he can play God with the weather. He thinks money can buy the wind." Leo wrapped the heavy metal chain around the barn door handles and clicked the lock shut, securing himself on the outside. He was going to stand between the storm and the barn. He was going to ensure his structural cables held, or he was going to die trying. "Tell my dad," Leo said, looking back at the stunned sheriff as the first heavy, violent snowflake drifted down from the purple sky. "Tell him I held the line." Darkness swallowed the Bitterroot Valley entirely by 6 o'clock. Though the sun had technically been blotted out hours before, this was no ordinary winter storm. It was a meteorological leviathan, a sprawling atmospheric beast born from the Arctic north and fueled by the unobstructed corridor Gregory Higgins had selfishly carved through the ridge. When the leading edge of the blizzard finally slammed into the valley floor, it did not arrive with a gradual buildup. It hit with the concussive force of a detonated explosive. Wind speeds instantly clocked in at over 80 miles per hour. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that vibrated deep within the marrow of Leo's bones. Standing near the massive wooden doors of the barn, Leo leaned hard against the freezing planks, his breath instantly freezing into crystalline shards on his heavy wool scarf. He strained his eyes through the blinding whiteout, desperately watching the wall of timber he had spent the last 3 weeks building. The first impact of the gale hit the arrowhead formation of the lodgepole pines. For a horrifying, breathless second, Leo thought they would snap. The tall, slender trunks bowed backward under the immense pressure, bending at angles that seemed physically impossible for solid wood. But they did not break, just as his grandfather's journals had predicted. The flexible outer layer absorbed the blunt force trauma of the wind, acting as a shock absorber. Behind them, the staggered, densely packed blue spruces caught the deflected air currents. Their interlocking, needle-heavy branches formed a nearly solid ramp of vegetation. Instead of slamming flat against a vertical surface, the catastrophic wind hit the wedge, split perfectly down the middle, and was forced violently upward and outward, bypassing the fragile wooden barn entirely. Leo watched in awe as a literal tunnel of calm formed around him. Above the barn, the snow was flying completely horizontal, a chaotic blur of lethal white frost. But down on the ground, in the pocket of low pressure created by the V-shaped tree line, the snow drifted down almost gently. The engineering was working perfectly, the fortress was holding. But nature is rarely defeated so easily. Around midnight, the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and the wind shifted violently to the northeast. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the howling void. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He squinted through the swirling ice and saw it immediately. The shift in wind direction had caught the right flank of the tree line off guard. One of the primary steel cables anchoring the largest blue spruce, the cornerstone of the entire right wedge, had snapped under the sudden, uneven tension. The massive tree was leaning precariously backward, its root ball shifting dangerously in the frozen earth. If that spruce fell, the interlocking shield would break. The wind would pour through the gap, creating a concentrated wind tunnel that would blast straight into the barn's sagging western wall. The climate silos would be ripped apart in minutes. Leo didn't think, he reacted, grabbing a heavy spare coil of braided steel cable and a heavy-duty ratcheting winch from his toolkit. He abandoned the safety of the barn's lee and sprinted directly into the teeth of the storm. The moment he stepped past the protective perimeter of the spruces, the wind hit him like a physical blow, knocking him flat onto the icy ground. The cold was absolute and agonizing, instantly biting through his insulated coveralls and searing his skin. He couldn't see past his own outstretched hands. He could only feel the violent, thrashing branches of the dying spruce tree above him. Crawling on his belly to avoid being blown away, Leo dragged the heavy winch through the snowdrifts. He reached the deep concrete pylon he had poured weeks ago, wrapping the new cable around the exposed iron rebar. His fingers, clad in thick leather gloves, felt like clumsy blocks of wood. He couldn't grip the metal clamps. Screaming in frustration, he tore his right glove off with his teeth, exposing his bare skin to the lethal chill. Operating purely on adrenaline, Leo threaded the icy steel cable through the winch hook, his bare flesh sticking painfully to the freezing metal. He dragged the other end toward the shifting trunk of the spruce, wrapping it tight around the thick bark. The tree groaned, tilting another few inches toward the barn. Bracing his boots against the concrete pylon, Leo began to crank the heavy ratcheting lever of the winch. Click, click, click. With every pull, his muscles tore, and his lungs burned as if he were inhaling crushed glass. The wind screamed in his ears, tearing at his clothes, actively fighting him for possession of his father's legacy. He cranked the lever again, pulling the massive spruce forward, forcing it back into alignment with the rest of the phalanx. With one final, desperate heave, the cable pulled taut, humming like a massive guitar string under the immense pressure. The tree locked back into place, sealing the breach. The wind was instantly redirected outward again, flowing smoothly over the top of the wedge. Leo collapsed backward into a snowdrift, completely spent. His bare right hand was a mottled, bruised purple, completely devoid of feeling. Hypothermia was setting in rapidly, making his brain feel thick and sluggish. A strange, comforting warmth began to spread from his chest outward, a deceptive symptom of freezing to death. He knew he needed to drag himself back to the sheltered pocket near the barn doors, but his legs refused to obey. Curling into a tight ball at the base of the mighty spruce he had just saved, Leo closed his eyes. The interlocking branches above him formed a thick roof, catching the snow and creating a small, insulated snow cave around his body. The storm raged on, tearing the rest of the Bitterroot Valley apart, but Leo drifted away, anchored securely to the earth by the very trees he had planted. Morning broke with a blinding, pristine cruelty. The sky over the Bitterroot Valley was a flawless, crystalline blue, betraying absolutely nothing of the violence that had occurred hours prior. Sheriff Tom Halstead sat behind the wheel of a county snowcat, the heavy metal treads crunching loudly over drifts that were, in some places, 10 feet high. Beside him sat Carl Jenkins, the burly cattle rancher, gripping the dashboard with pale hands. They had spent the last 3 hours digging out trapped families and surveying the widespread devastation. Barns were flattened, power lines were snapped like twigs, and entire herds of livestock were buried under the drifts. But their deepest dread was reserved for the Farnsworth property. They both knew that without the northern ridge to block the wind, Leo's ancient barn stood absolutely no chance. "I shouldn't have left him, Carl," Halstead muttered, his voice thick with guilt as they crested the final hill leading to the farm. "I should have dragged that boy out of there in handcuffs if I had to." "You couldn't have known it would be this bad, Tom," Carl replied softly, though his eyes reflected the same grim expectation. As the snowcat cleared the ridge, both men fell dead silent. Sitting in the middle of a barren, wind-scoured plain of ice was the Farnsworth barn. It was completely, miraculously untouched. Not a single wooden slat was missing. Not a single window was broken. Surrounding the northern and western walls was a towering, majestic fortress of snow-encased pine trees. The aerodynamic wedge had worked flawlessly. The heavy drifts of snow were piled high on the outside of the tree line, but directly behind the evergreens, the ground was barely dusted with white. Halstead slammed the snowcat into park before it even fully stopped, throwing open the door and leaping into the thigh-deep snow. "Leo," he roared, his voice echoing off the silent trees. They found him near the perimeter, curled beneath the protective boughs of a massive blue spruce. He was unconscious, his skin pale and lips tinged with blue, but as Halstead frantically stripped off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the boy, a faint, ragged breath plumed in the cold air. "He's alive, get the medkit from the cab," Halstead yelled, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. The heavy canopy of the spruces, combined with the deep snowdrift, had created an igloo-like thermal pocket, trapping just enough of Leo's body heat to keep him from slipping over the edge. 2 days later, Leo woke up in a sterile white room at the Missoula County Hospital. The steady beep of a heart monitor was the first thing he registered, followed by a dull, throbbing ache in his heavily bandaged right hand. He turned his head and saw his father, Arthur, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his eyes red from crying. "You foolish, brilliant, stubborn boy," Arthur whispered, wheeling himself closer and gently grasping Leo's unbandaged left hand. "Sheriff Halstead told me what you did. You saved the silos. You saved everything." But the true victory was only realized a week later, when the snow finally melted enough for the rest of the valley to witness the shocking aftermath of the storm. The wind that had bypassed the Farnsworth barn hadn't just vanished. Redirected by Leo's meticulously angled tree line, the compressed, high-velocity air currents had funneled directly down the adjacent slope, straight into the heart of Gregory Higgins' sprawling estate. Because Higgins had clear-cut the northern ridge, he had absolutely no natural defenses remaining. The redirected wind vortex had utterly leveled his multi-million-dollar, newly constructed industrial greenhouses. His entire winter crop of modified soybeans was annihilated, his expensive machinery buried under tons of collapsed steel and shattered glass. Higgins' greed had literally paved the path for his own destruction. Furthermore, an immediate investigation launched by the State Environmental Commission revealed that Higgins had illegally clear-cut the ridge without proper permits, resulting in catastrophic fines that immediately bankrupted his agricultural empire. By the time spring finally thawed the frozen Montana soil, the landscape of Oak Haven had changed forever. David Caldwell, a senior representative from a highly respected, ethical agricultural research firm based out of Seattle, drove out to the Farnsworth property. He didn't come to steal, he came to partner, having heard the legendary story of the boy who fought a 50-year blizzard to protect a barn. Caldwell's firm tested Arthur's seeds. They were everything Arthur promised and more. The resulting patent deal was worth $6 million. It was more than enough to cover Arthur's physical therapy, hire a full crew of farmhands, and completely rebuild the sagging barn using modern steel and reinforced concrete. But Leo never touched the trees. Years later, long after Arthur had learned to walk with a cane and the Farnsworth farm had become the most prosperous and respected independent operation in the entire state, the massive wall of blue spruce and lodgepole pines remained. They grew taller, thicker, and stronger with each passing season, a towering permanent monument to defiance, engineering, and the unbreakable will of a son fighting for his family's survival. If you were captivated by Leo's incredible battle against the elements and human greed, make sure to hit that like button right now. Share this story with friends who love a brilliant underdog victory, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life tales of survival and triumph. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done in Leo's shoes. Could you have braved the storm? See you in the next video.